There comes a moment in life when you finally pause and ask yourself a painful question. Why do I always feel like I'm too much? Too emotional, too intense, too honest, too expressive, too sensitive. And for years, you may have believed that question meant something was wrong with you. But what if the problem was never your depth? What if it was the environment that couldn't breathe at your level? Human beings are not born thinking they are too much. That belief is learned, absorbed slowly through raised eyebrows, dismissed feelings, interrupted sentences, and love that came with conditions. And when that happens repeatedly, the mind doesn't blame the situation. It blames the self. Tonight we are dismantling that illusion. Because you were never too much. You were simply with the wrong people. You were never excessive in your emotions, your thoughts, or your presence. What you were experiencing was something far more subtle and far more misunderstood. You were mirroring the limits of others. And when people are confronted with their own limits, they rarely respond with curiosity. More often, they respond with discomfort, defensiveness, or rejection. That reaction then gets placed back onto you as if you were the source of the problem, when in truth, you were simply revealing something that already existed. From a psychological perspective, human beings unconsciously measure themselves through comparison. When someone enters a room with emotional depth, self-awareness, creativity, or intensity, it disrupts the internal equilibrium of those who have learned to survive by staying shallow, guarded, or emotionally asleep. Your openness challenges their coping mechanisms. Your curiosity exposes their avoidance. Your authenticity highlights the parts of themselves they have not dared to examine. And because facing those parts requires courage, growth, and sometimes pain, it feels easier to label you as too much than to question their own inner confinement. Think about how often you were told to tone it down, to relax, to stop overthinking, to stop feeling so deeply. Those words were not instructions for your well-being. They were signals of someone else's discomfort. When a person has spent years suppressing their emotions, your ability to feel freely can feel threatening. When someone has built their identity around fitting in, your refusal to dilute yourself feels like rebellion. When someone has never questioned the life handed to them, your questions feel like an accusation. This is not because you were wrong. It is because you were awake in spaces that required sleep to function. There is a psychological mechanism at work here: projection. People unconsciously project their unresolved conflicts onto those who remind them of what they have avoided becoming. Your depth became the screen onto which they projected their fear of inadequacy. Your honesty became the surface onto which they placed their guilt for their own silence. Your passion became the mirror reflecting their numbness. And mirrors, especially honest ones, are rarely welcomed by those who fear what they might see. Consider a real life example that plays out in countless families. A child who asks questions, expresses emotions openly, or resists blind obedience is often labeled difficult or dramatic. Yet years later, that same child becomes the one who breaks generational patterns, who seeks therapy, who names the unspoken wounds. The family did not reject the child because the child was flawed. The family reacted because the child disrupted the unspoken agreement to remain unconscious. The child mirrored the family's emotional limitations, and instead of expanding, the system tried to suppress the reflection. The same dynamic appears in relationships. When you bring vulnerability into a connection with someone who has learned to survive through emotional detachment, your openness feels like pressure. Not because you are demanding too much, but because you are asking them silently to be more than they have learned how to be. So they retreat. They minimize you. They tell you that you are intense, needy, or overwhelming. In reality, you are asking for presence, and presence is something they have never learned to offer, even to themselves. Research in emotional psychology supports this pattern. Studies show that individuals with higher emotional awareness often experience more resistance in environments dominated by emotional avoidance, not because emotional awareness is unhealthy, but because it disrupts the emotional status quo. Systems prefer stability over truth, and when truth arrives too loudly, stability fights back. You likely internalized this resistance. You began to believe that your natural way of being was excessive. You questioned your reactions. You rehearsed your words before speaking. You learned to monitor your emotional volume so others wouldn't feel threatened. This is how self-doubt is born, not from inherent weakness, but from repeated exposure to environments that could not hold your full expression. But here is the crucial insight: a mirror does not create what it reflects. It only reveals it. When people responded negatively to you, they were not responding to your essence. They were responding to their own unfinished inner work. Their irritation was not about your intensity. It was about their suppression. Their dismissal was not about your emotions. It was about their fear of feeling. Their judgment was not about your curiosity. It was about their resistance to change. And this is why shrinking never brought peace. Because no matter how small you made yourself, the tension remained. The discomfort persisted. You could silence your voice, but you could not silence the truth your presence represented. Something about you continued to stir what others wanted to keep asleep. And so the blame continued. Not because you failed to adapt enough, but because adaptation was never the solution. There is a quiet grief in realizing how long you carried responsibility for emotions that were never yours to manage. You believed that if you could just be calmer, quieter, less expressive, more agreeable, then connection would finally feel safe. But safety built on self-erasure is not safety at all. It is captivity. True connection does not require you to abandon your depth. It requires others to meet you there. And when they cannot, it is not a verdict on your worth. It is information about their capacity. When you begin to see this clearly, something shifts. You stop asking, "What is wrong with me?" and start asking, "Where am I placing my energy?" You realize that your sensitivity is not a flaw but a finely tuned instrument, that your intensity is not chaos but clarity, that your emotional honesty is not excess but courage. In the right environment, your presence does not feel like a disruption. It feels like relief. People do not ask you to tone it down. They ask you to go deeper. They do not flinch at your emotions. They recognize themselves through them. They do not feel exposed by your questions. They feel invited. And perhaps the most liberating realization of all is this: you were never meant to be understood by everyone. Depth is not universal. Consciousness is not comfortable. Growth is not appealing to those committed to familiarity. Your role was never to fit into every space, but to find or create spaces that could expand with you. You were not too much. You were simply reflecting what others had not yet become. You learned early that belonging often came with a price. It was not stated outright, but it was felt in the pauses, in the raised eyebrows, in the subtle withdrawal of warmth when you expressed too much of yourself. So you adapted, you adjusted your tone, filtered your thoughts, softened your reactions, and told yourself this was maturity, that this was growth, that this was what emotionally intelligent people do. But what you were really doing, slowly and quietly, was confusing adaptation with self-betrayal. Adaptation is meant to help us survive external conditions. It is a natural psychological response to environments that feel unsafe or unpredictable. A child adapts to a volatile home by becoming quiet. A partner adapts to emotional distance by asking for less. An employee adapts to a rigid system by hiding creativity. In the beginning, adaptation feels like wisdom. It feels like control. It feels like learning how the world works. But when adaptation requires the abandonment of your inner truth, it stops being intelligence and becomes erasure. You were not born doubting your instincts. That doubt was taught. Every time you were told you were overreacting, too sensitive, or thinking too deeply, a small fracture formed between what you felt and what you were allowed to express. Over time, those fractures widened. You began to second-guess your emotional responses. You asked others to validate what you already knew. You learned to wait for permission before trusting your own perception. This is how self-betrayal begins, not as a dramatic act, but as a quiet habit. The human psyche is designed to seek connection, even at great personal cost. Research in attachment psychology shows that people will often suppress their authentic needs in order to preserve relationships, especially when those relationships feel essential for safety or identity. You did not shrink because you lacked strength. You shrank because the need to belong felt stronger than the permission to be whole. And in environments where love felt conditional, adaptation became the currency of acceptance. Think about the moments you silenced yourself to keep the peace. The conversations where you chose harmony over honesty. The relationships where you accepted less than you needed because asking for more felt dangerous. You told yourself you were being flexible, understanding, patient. But inside, something was tightening, a quiet resentment, a dull sadness, a sense that you were living slightly outside your own life. These were not signs of immaturity, they were signals of self-betrayal. The tragedy of this confusion is that it often receives praise. People reward you for being easy, agreeable, low maintenance. They tell you how calm you are, how strong you are, how little you ask for. But what they are really complimenting is your willingness to disappear for their comfort. And because that praise feels like relief, like finally being accepted, it reinforces the pattern. You learn that love arrives when you abandon yourself. Over time, this abandonment does not remain external. It becomes internalized. You begin to preemptively silence yourself before anyone else can. You edit your desires before they reach your mouth. You feel guilt for wanting reassurance, depth, intimacy. You experience shame for having needs at all. This is the moment adaptation fully transforms into self-betrayal, when you no longer need others to suppress you, because you have learned to do it yourself. There is a psychological cost to this. Studies on emotional suppression consistently show increased anxiety, depression, and a diminished sense of identity over time. When feelings are not expressed, they do not disappear, they turn inward. They manifest as fatigue, numbness, irritability, or a vague sense of emptiness. You may have wondered why you felt disconnected even in the presence of others, why joy felt muted, why something always felt missing. What was missing was you. Self-betrayal is exhausting because it requires constant vigilance. You are always monitoring the room, measuring your impact, adjusting your volume. You become hyper, aware of how you are perceived, and disconnected from how you actually feel. The inner world and the outer presentation drift further apart, and the psyche strains to hold them together. This tension is not sustainable. Eventually, something cracks, burnout, emotional withdrawal, or a sudden awakening that says, I cannot live like this anymore. That awakening often comes quietly. It arrives as a question you can no longer ignore. Why do I feel so lonely even when I am not alone? Or, why does being needed feel more familiar than being known? These questions are not signs of weakness. They are signs of integration trying to occur. The psyche seeks wholeness, and it will eventually rebel against prolonged self-betrayal. The truth is, real adaptation does not require the loss of self. Healthy adaptation allows you to navigate the world while remaining anchored in your values, emotions, and truth. Self-betrayal asks you to exchange authenticity for approval. And approval is a poor substitute for belonging because it is always conditional and easily withdrawn. When you begin to recognize this, a subtle but profound shift occurs. You start noticing the moments where you override yourself. You feel the tension when you say yes but mean no. You sense the grief when you minimize your joy or dilute your pain. And instead of dismissing these signals, you begin to listen. This is not selfishness. This is self-reclamation. Reclaiming yourself does not mean becoming rigid or unkind. It means allowing your inner experience to have a voice again. It means trusting your emotional signals as information rather than inconvenience. It means understanding that any connection that requires your disappearance is not connection at all, but negotiation. There will be fear in this process. The fear of being misunderstood. The fear of being rejected. The fear that without adaptation, you will be alone. But what you eventually discover is that the loneliness you feared has already been present, hidden beneath compliance. And as you slowly stop betraying yourself, that loneliness begins to lift, replaced by something steadier and more real self-respect. You were never meant to survive your life by abandoning yourself. Adaptation was a skill you learned in response to limitation. But self-betrayal was never the goal. It was a misunderstanding born from the belief that you had to be less in order to be loved. And once that belief loosens its grip, you begin the most important work of all, returning to yourself. From an early age, many of us learn an unspoken rule: fitting in is safer than standing out. It is not taught directly, but it is reinforced through subtle rewards and quiet punishments. When you agree, when you blend in, when you keep your differences hidden, life feels smoother. Approval comes more easily, conflict decreases. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin to associate conformity with acceptance and authenticity with risk. In the presence of the wrong people, this association becomes a powerful conditioning force, shaping not only how you behave, but how you understand yourself. Wrong people do not usually appear cruel or overtly controlling. More often, they present themselves as reasonable, normal, even caring. What distinguishes them is not malice, but limitation. Their sense of safety depends on predictability. Their relationships function best when everyone follows the same emotional rules, thinks within the same boundaries, and reflects the same values back to them. In such environments, conformity is not just preferred, it is quietly rewarded. You are praised for being easy, for not causing discomfort, for not asking difficult questions. You are liked when you do not disturb the emotional order of the group. Authenticity, however, introduces uncertainty. It carries difference, complexity, and emotional truth. And for those who rely on sameness to feel secure, authenticity feels like a threat. When you speak honestly, when you express depth, when you deviate from the expected script, you expose the fragile structure beneath their sense of normalcy. Rather than examine that fragility, they respond by encouraging you to return to the familiar. Not through force, but through withdrawal, through subtle disapproval, through the quiet message that love and belonging are conditional. Over time, this conditioning works. You notice which parts of you are welcomed and which are merely tolerated. You learn which thoughts earn smiles and which earn silence. And without anyone explicitly telling you to change, you begin to edit yourself. You soften opinions, suppress curiosity, restrain emotion. You tell yourself you are being considerate, adaptable, mature. But beneath that narrative, a deeper truth is forming. You are learning that being yourself costs you connection. Psychological research on group dynamics shows that many social systems prioritize cohesion over authenticity. Groups often unconsciously discourage individuality to maintain stability, especially when that individuality challenges shared beliefs or emotional norms. The group rewards those who conform because they reinforce the existing structure. Those who diverge are not necessarily rejected outright, but they are subtly marginalized. This marginalization teaches a powerful lesson: safety lies in sameness. The danger is not that you conform temporarily. The danger is that you begin to believe conformity is who you are. When authenticity is repeatedly met with resistance, the psyche adapts by dissociating from it. You stop trusting your instincts. You begin to question whether your feelings are valid. You wonder if your desires are excessive or unreasonable. This internal conflict creates a split between the self you present and the self you experience. And maintaining that split requires constant effort. In relationships shaped by conformity, you are valued not for who you are, but for how well you fit the role assigned to you. You are appreciated as long as you remain consistent, predictable, and emotionally manageable. Growth becomes inconvenient. Change becomes threatening. If you evolve beyond the expectations placed on you, the relationship strains, not because growth is wrong, but because it disrupts the agreement that kept things comfortable. Many people experience this in families. The one who questions traditions is labeled difficult. The one who feels deeply is called dramatic. The one who seeks meaning is told to be practical. These labels are not descriptions of character, they are defenses against disruption. Families, like all systems, resist change. Authenticity challenges inherited patterns, and those patterns fight to preserve themselves. The same pattern appears in workplaces that value obedience over creativity, and in friendships that depend on shared avoidance rather than shared truth. In all these spaces, conformity is mistaken for harmony. But harmony built on suppression is fragile. It requires silence, it requires denial, and it collapses the moment someone dares to be real. There is a particular kind of loneliness that arises in these environments. It is not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being unseen. You are present, but not known, engaged, but not understood. Over time, this loneliness erodes vitality. You may begin to feel numb, uninspired, disconnected from your own life. You may wonder why everything looks fine on the surface, yet feels empty beneath it. This emptiness is not a personal failure. It is the cost of living in spaces that reward conformity instead of truth. Authenticity is life, giving because it aligns inner experience with outer expression. When that alignment is broken, energy drains away. Joy becomes muted. Purpose feels distant. The self retreats, waiting for conditions that allow it to emerge again. What makes this especially painful is that conformity is often framed as love. You are told that if you truly cared, you would be more accommodating, less intense, more like everyone else. But real care does not require you to disappear. Real connection does not depend on your silence. When someone can only relate to you, as long as you remain within their comfort zone, they are not relating to you at all. They are relating to the version of you that keeps them safe. Understanding this can feel both liberating and unsettling. It forces you to confront how much of yourself you have traded for belonging. It raises difficult questions about where you have been accepted and where you have merely been tolerated. And it invites a deeper inquiry: what would happen if you stopped performing and started expressing? The fear is obvious. Authenticity risks rejection. It disrupts established dynamics. It may cost you certain relationships. But conformity has already cost you something just as significant: your sense of self. The choice is not between connection and isolation. It is between false belonging and true alignment. In the presence of the right people, authenticity is not punished. It is welcomed. Difference is not seen as a threat, but as enrichment. Growth is not resisted, but celebrated. You do not have to earn space by shrinking. You are not asked to stay the same to remain loved. Instead, you are allowed to expand, to change, to become more fully yourself. Wrong people reward conformity because it keeps them comfortable. Right people honor authenticity because it keeps the relationship alive. And as you begin to recognize this distinction, you gain a powerful form of clarity. You stop measuring your worth by how well you fit in. You start measuring it by how deeply you are allowed to be yourself. Somewhere along the way, you began carrying weight that was never meant to be yours. It did not arrive as a single decision or a conscious choice. It accumulated quietly through moments when you sensed tension and rushed to ease it, when you noticed disappointment and blamed yourself for it, when someone else's discomfort became something you felt responsible to fix. Over time, this habit settled into your identity. You became the one who held everything together, the one who understood, the one who adjusted. And without realizing it, you took responsibility for what was never your burden. Human beings are deeply attuned to emotional cues, especially in environments where safety feels uncertain. When harmony feels fragile, the psyche searches for control, and one of the easiest ways to gain control is to take responsibility. If you believe that other people's emotions are your fault, you also believe that you can prevent pain by managing yourself more carefully. This belief offers an illusion of safety, but it comes at a steep cost. It teaches you to monitor, anticipate, and regulate not only your own inner world, but the emotional worlds of everyone around you. You likely learned this early. Perhaps you grew up in a household where emotions were unpredictable, where peace depended on someone staying calm, agreeable, or silent. Or maybe you learned it in relationships where love was inconsistent, where attention arrived only when you were accommodating and left when you expressed your needs. In such environments, taking responsibility for others' feelings becomes a survival strategy. You tell yourself that if you can just be better, quieter, more understanding, everything will be okay. At first, this strategy is rewarded. You are praised for being mature, empathetic, strong. People lean on you. They trust you with their struggles. They rely on your emotional labor. And because being needed feels meaningful, you accept the role willingly. What you do not notice at first is how one-sided the exchange becomes. You hold space, but no one holds space for you. You absorb emotions, but yours remain unacknowledged. You become the container, not the content. Psychologically, this pattern is reinforced by a blurred boundary between empathy and responsibility. Empathy allows you to understand and feel with others. Responsibility asks you to carry what belongs to them. When these two are confused, compassion turns into self-sacrifice. You begin to believe that if someone is unhappy, you must have done something wrong. If someone is angry, it must be your fault. If someone withdraws, you assume you failed them in some way. Research on emotional boundaries shows that people who habitually over-responsibilize themselves for others' feelings experience higher levels of anxiety and chronic guilt. This is not because they care too much, but because they have been conditioned to believe that love requires self-erasure. The nervous system remains on constant alert, scanning for emotional shifts, preparing to intervene, apologize, or explain. Rest becomes difficult because vigilance never truly ends. You may recognize this pattern in the way you apologize reflexively, even when you have done nothing wrong. In the way you soften your truth to avoid making others uncomfortable. In the way you feel uneasy expressing disappointment, as if having a need is an imposition. These behaviors are not flaws. They are evidence of a long-standing belief that your role is to carry emotional weight so others do not have to. The tragedy is that this responsibility was never assigned to you explicitly. You assumed it because you cared, because you wanted connection, because you believed it was the price of being loved. But over time, this assumption distorts your sense of self. You stop asking what you feel because you are too busy managing what others feel. You lose access to your own emotional signals. Fatigue sets in, resentment simmers quietly beneath your kindness. And yet, you keep going because letting go of responsibility feels dangerous, even selfish. There is a profound difference between being supportive and being responsible. Support says, I can walk with you. Responsibility says, I must carry you. The first allows connection. The second creates imbalance. When you consistently take on what belongs to others, you deny them the opportunity to confront, process, and grow from their own emotions. And you deny yourself the right to exist without constant obligation. This pattern often becomes most visible when you finally reach your limit. You feel burned out, emotionally numb, or inexplicably angry. You may wonder why giving so much has left you feeling so empty. The answer is not that you gave too little to yourself. It is that you gave what was never yours to give. You mistook emotional availability for emotional responsibility, and the weight eventually became too heavy to carry. Letting go of this burden does not mean becoming cold or indifferent. It means restoring appropriate boundaries. It means recognizing that other people's reactions are shaped by their histories, their wounds, their expectations. You can influence, but you cannot control. You can care, but you cannot carry. This distinction is not a withdrawal of love. It is a return to balance. As you begin to release responsibility, guilt often surfaces. You may fear that without your constant management, relationships will fall apart, and some may, but what falls apart under the weight of boundaries was never held together by mutual respect. Healthy connections do not depend on one person absorbing all the emotional strain. They are resilient because responsibility is shared, not hoarded. There is a quiet relief that comes when you stop preemptively apologizing for existing, when you allow others to sit with their discomfort without rushing to resolve it, when you trust that it is not your job to make everyone feel okay. This relief is not apathy. It is self-trust returning after a long absence. You begin to notice your own emotions again. You feel clearer, lighter, more present. You respond instead of react. You choose instead of accommodate. And in doing so, you model something powerful. Emotional responsibility belongs to the individual, not to the most sensitive person in the room. You were never meant to be the caretaker of everyone else's inner world. Your empathy was a gift, not a contract. The burden you carried was born from misunderstanding, not obligation. And as you slowly set it down, you reclaim the energy that was always meant to be yours, allowing you to engage with life not as a shield for others, but as a whole and present human being. There is a particular kind of H that comes from being surrounded by people and still feeling invisible. You speak, but your words seem to dissolve before they reach anyone. You feel deeply, yet your emotions are met with impatience or indifference. Over time, you begin to question not just whether you are understood, but whether you are even allowed to be fully present. This pain does not arise because you are unworthy of being heard. It arises because you have been living in environments that could not recognize you. And the truth, often discovered slowly and with great relief, is that in the right environment, you will feel seen, not silenced. Human beings are relational by nature. We develop our sense of self through reflection, through being recognized by others as we recognize ourselves. When that reflection is distorted or absent, the psyche struggles. You may have noticed how your energy changes depending on where you are. In some spaces, you feel tense, cautious, and guarded, as though every word must be carefully measured. In others, you feel open, alive, and at ease, as though something within you has been given permission to breathe. This difference is not accidental. It reveals the power of environment on identity. When you exist in spaces that cannot meet your emotional depth, your expressiveness is often mistaken for disruption. Curiosity becomes questioning. Vulnerability becomes weakness. Passion becomes excess. The message you receive is subtle, but persistent. Your presence is inconvenient. And because humans are wired to seek belonging, you adapt. You speak less. You share selectively. You shrink the parts of yourself that seem to cause friction. What you are actually doing is responding to an environment that lacks the capacity to hold you. Psychological studies on emotional validation show that being seen and heard activates a sense of safety in the nervous system. When your internal experiences are acknowledged without judgment, your body relaxes. Your mind becomes clearer, creativity and confidence increase. When that validation is absent, the opposite occurs. You become hypervigilant, you second-guess yourself. You feel a constant low-grade anxiety, as though you are always on the verge of saying or doing the wrong thing. This is not a personal flaw. It is a physiological response to emotional neglect. Silencing does not always take the form of overt rejection. More often, it is subtle. Your stories are interrupted. Your feelings are minimized. Your ideas are met with polite indifference. Over time, these small dismissals accumulate. You begin to internalize the belief that your inner world is either irrelevant or burdensome. This internalization is particularly damaging because it teaches you to censor yourself before anyone else has the chance to. You become both the speaker and the silencer. But this pattern is not permanent. It is situational. When you encounter the right environment, something profound shifts. You notice that you are listened to without rushing. Your emotions are met with curiosity instead of correction. You are allowed to finish your thoughts. There is space for nuance, for complexity, for pauses. You do not have to perform or prove your worth. You are received as you are. And in that reception, parts of you that have been dormant begin to awaken. Feeling seen is not about constant agreement or validation. It is about recognition. It is about having your reality acknowledged, even when it differs from others. In the right environment, difference does not threaten connection. It enriches it. Your perspective adds dimension rather than discomfort. You are not required to simplify yourself to maintain harmony. Harmony emerges from mutual respect, not uniformity. There is often grief in this realization. You may look back at the years you spent trying to earn understanding from people who were never equipped to offer it. You may mourn the conversations you never had, the emotions you swallowed, the versions of yourself that remained unexplored. This grief is natural. It marks the end of a misunderstanding, the belief that you were the problem. In truth, you were asking for oxygen in places that were built for shallow breathing. The right environment does not demand that you be less. It does not flinch at your honesty or retreat from your depth. Instead, it invites you to expand. You find that your voice steadies. Your thoughts flow more freely. You no longer feel the urge to apologize for taking up space. Silence, when it occurs, is comfortable rather than tense. It is chosen, not imposed. In such spaces, growth feels safer. You are more willing to explore difficult emotions, to admit uncertainty, to evolve. This safety does not come from perfection, but from presence. You are allowed to be in process. You are met where you are, not where others wish you would be. And because you are seen, you no longer need to shout to be heard or withdraw to protect yourself. This experience often redefines your understanding of connection. You realize that love and belonging are not something you earn through self-editing. They arise naturally when there is alignment. You also recognize that some relationships could only exist at the cost of your silence. Letting go of those relationships is painful, but it creates space for ones that do not require your disappearance. As you become more attuned to environments that nourish you, your intuition sharpens. You notice how your body responds in different spaces. Where do you feel relaxed? Where do you feel constricted? Where do your thoughts flow? Where do they stall? These sensations are not random. They are signals guiding you toward places and people where you can exist fully. Being seen is not about being constantly affirmed. It is about being acknowledged as real. In the right environment, your emotions are not problems to be solved. Your questions are not challenges to authority. Your presence is not something to be managed. It is something to be welcomed. And perhaps the most healing realization of all is this: you did not lose your voice. It was waiting for a space that could hear it. Once that space appears, you do not have to force expression. It returns naturally, carrying with it a sense of wholeness that reminds you who you have always been. And when all of this finally settles inside you, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Nothing about you was ever excessive, broken, or misplaced. What felt like rejection was often misalignment. What felt like silencing was often a lack of capacity around you, not a lack of value within you. You were asking to be met in spaces that had never learned how to see. As you move forward, you no longer measure yourself by how well you can shrink, soften, or disappear to maintain connection. You measure your life by how honestly you are allowed to exist. You choose environments where your voice does not compete for air, where your emotions are not corrected, and where your presence feels like contribution rather than disruption. You trust the quiet relief that comes when you are finally understood without explanation. This is where wholeness begins, not in changing who you are, but in placing yourself where who you are can be received. When you stop mistaking silence for peace and conformity for belonging, you reclaim your right to be fully alive. And in doing so, you discover that being seen was never something you had to earn. It was always something you deserved.